Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March 5th Baltimore WordPress Meetup. Today, we are going to be talking about online payments and PCI DSS 4.0 and what the heck that means to your business. The Baltimore WordPress Meetup video and links will be available in about 2 weeks or so. The links that have been shared in the Zoom chat during the session will be available at the end of the recording. So make sure to check the end of the recording if you need those specific links later. The Baltimore WordPress Meetup is an informational meetup. Please use the information, products, and services that we show at your own risk. Just because we are showing a website, plugin, theme, or other product is not an official WordPress endorsement of it. Above all, keep it family friendly, as most of us are attending from home. We will be doing our best to follow the WordPress community guidelines. That means that if you break these rules, we will evict you from the meeting. No spamming or spammer-like behavior. We have people of all different skill levels and backgrounds, so no judgment when someone is at a different place than where you are at. And generally speaking, don't be a jerk. We have a couple of sponsors to thank for sponsoring our meetup. Enfira LLC. Enfira helps companies serious about their WordPress development needs. They specialize in helping agencies and businesses that are frustrated by their WordPress challenges. Visit them at enfira.com. Easy Alley Guide. Easy Alley Guide works to make web accessibility easier to implement through done-for-you tools and processes for both individuals and especially web agencies. For more information on accessibility, including a whole bunch of tools, tutorials, and learn material, please visit easyalleyguide.com. And our third sponsor is OB Digital Consulting. OB sponsors our YouTube video recordings. Contact them for assistance with video production needs. Some quick admin: we will use the chat to queue people up and for short questions. So go find your Zoom chat. Everyone is muted to start. And of course, no one knows everything, but we'll do our best to answer questions. Joining us today, we have Zac from Hypertech Solutions, and he's going to be talking to us about PCI DSS and what this means to our businesses. So Zac, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
My name is Zac Lewallen. I'm the owner of Hypertech Solutions, and I specialize in all things compliance. We have clients that range in verticals that deal with HIPAA compliance, NIST compliance, and of course PCI compliance. And so I nerd out on all things compliance management. And so I know today Jen wanted to talk through, I guess, PCI DSS 4.0 and all the things that are kind of coming along with that.
Yes. So the big question that everyone has is, what the heck is this thing? Because for years, we've heard just use a third-party payment system like Stripe and you're done. And for years, that has been, the rule. But that's not true anymore, is it?
No, and PCI DSS is something that has evolved over time, and each time they come out with a new version, they make clarifications, they make changes, and it evolves just like our industry evolves.
And so to be really clear, these are requirements that come down from Visa and Mastercard. So they apply in every single country.
That is
And
correct.
and also the old cap, if I remember, for version 3 was that if you had 20,000 transactions or fewer, then you really didn't have to worry about much. But these new requirements specifically target these smaller card acceptors who are handling these, under 20,000.
Yeah, so a lot of the clarifications and changes, also change certain people's scope of what, they would normally be classified as when it comes to PCI DSS. And so, yeah, previously you may have had different levels to where you may have been exempt if you weren't of that level for based on revenue or just based on that scope. But now it is more so just based on function. I think is the one of the biggest changes.
Yes. So the question that we get from everyone is, does it apply to me? So let's just talk through a couple of the common ways that people are accepting cards. And can you kind of just quick give us a yes, no on whether or not these new requirements apply to these people? So the first one is I have a credit card form on my site. So that could be part of like a form tool, that could be WooCommerce, that could be many of the other options, but there's a credit card form on your website.
Yes, and because everything has shifted more from a transaction volume based to a risk based. So whenever you deal with having just a form on your site, again, each of these forms might implement things a little bit differently, whether it's using, let's say, like a Stripe Elements or a Stripe checkout built
Mhm.
into that form. While we could go into you want to be wary of like how it's implementing that because some of them are inherently insecure. Yes, it does mean that you are within the scope of of that, whether it just be with SAQA or SAQ AEP.
So the next one is, what if I just have a button on my site? They click that button and then they end up on PayPal.com and they complete everything else, the actual credit card inputs on PayPal.com.
Still yes, because even if you're redirecting, you're still responsible for being the source of that redirect. But also when you're think about when you're dealing with sending receipts and things along those lines, you're dealing with not just card information, but the client or customer information as well.
Then the next one is, okay, what if I run off to Shopify? Does that get rid of these problems or challenges?
No, because whenever it comes to what you're dealing with, while you may use Shop Pay or something like that to process the cards, you're still interacting with those systems, interacting with plugins. For example, one of the big things they make clarification for is keeping an inventory of all scripts that run on your site that, in order to prevent things like skimming, things along those lines.
Mhm.
So whenever you connect anything up to a payment gateway, there is some form of a scope that you are responsible for, even if it's at the most minimal level.
So, for example, a lot of people might use something like Hotjar or Microsoft Clarity to, try and monitor what's going on, or they might be using third-party A/B testing software to try and optimize things. So all of that starts to come into play.
Correct. It's where you're keeping an inventory of every script that runs on your site because you're also, by doing that, being able to keep tabs on things that might be maliciously running on your sites and
Mhm.
be able to report against it. Again, they've really pushed everything towards being more of a risk-based, I guess, scoring of what scope you need to be in. But that's where you find, identify what scope you need to be at based on your risk and apply it accordingly.
And then the next one people ask about is, tons of us use invoicing software. There's so many different FreshBooks, Quicken, and QuickBooks, and Zero, and all the others. Does any of this apply to using inventory or invoicing software like those platforms?
Yes, again, you're probably still going to fall underneath in 99% of cases like SAQA because you are taking that information. Let's say you ever export a PDF with any information on it, with customer information, you're still being part of that whole chain.
And then the next question that I usually hear is, what about these like third-party booking systems? So many people are using Calendly and many of these other different third-party booking systems.
Yeah, most of those are going to end up still falling within that because you're going to be like a lot of those saying, oh, we have a Stripe integration or we have a PayPal integration, and
Mhm.
you're providing your keys and doing that. That
Yep.
point, you're still in charge of making sure you're securing those keys. If you read the terms and conditions, it's always, hey, you're responsible for that, your compliance, all of those good things.
Awesome. So now we're kind of flip over to a little bit about that. What the heck is the SAQA and the SAQEP that you've been talking about? I'm going to drop the link to this page into the chat. So this is the official PCI securitystandards.org. And so this is where you should really go to get your official documents.
Yes, I always recommend just go straight to the source when it comes to those. Whenever you're dealing with compliance, details matter. So that's why a lot of times you'll see they come out with like DSS 4.0.01. They'll make clarifications on things. So you always want to make sure that those clarifications aren't sending you one way or another as to how you're implementing your compliance. So One thing that we get questions on a lot is like, well, how do I know my scope? And that is something that is variable depending on the business and depending on exactly how you're implementing. There's so many different tools out there and ways to, take credit cards and to performing commerce on the internet. And so each time, we assess a business or look at it, we want to be able to identify what scope they fall within. And of course, you try to minimize what that scope is, because the more broad your scope is, the more work you've got to do to make sure you're both staying secure and remediating any issues that you do have when you initially try to go after, PCI compliance. And so, whenever you're, starting this process, and they've got a nice flow chart available where you can see, in a good guess, like where you fall in terms of that. But most people inside the WordPress space are going to fall with at least within SAQA or AEP. And so, if you're going in there, you can see how I think it's around 24, 25 questions when you got your self-assessment for A, and it's about twice that amount for AEP.
Yeah, so here I've pulled up the A document, and it's got a bunch of information about the document changes and contents and a whole bunch of things, but it also does include a starter section that kind of helps to tell you whether or not this is for you. And then if at some point you could grab me that the flowchart link, because I don't have it handy.
Yes, I can find one.
All right, and then we are going to go ahead and open it up to questions. So if you have a question, put just a question mark into the chat, or you can type a short question. If you just put a question mark in the chat, I will unmute you so that you can go ahead and speak your question to the group. And go ahead and bring out the question. I have this specific setup. What does that mean for me? That's perfectly fine. Zach is here to help. Our first question is from Karen. And is there any way we can get a checklist of what we need to do?
So, in a lot of situations, it's not just a checklist. It's more of a, and because some of these things are policy driven, and there's other like supporting documents that you'll have with it. And so, yes, the self-assessment questionnaires are in of themselves like serving as a checklist to say you're doing these things. But then there's also like some of the underlying, I guess, process level and organizational level stuff that apply to all PCI compliance. So it's not always as simple as like this checklist, do this, and that. It's more of a, you're not only performing and implementing these things, but then you're maintaining them over time. Because every time a new update comes out for, let's say, one of your favorite plugins or things like that, you got to
Mhm.
make sure that you're not running new scripts that you shouldn't. Anytime you spin up a new site and have access to anything that touches your PCI scope, making sure proper multi-factor is implemented is that. So again, it's a moving target all the time. So it's not as easy as
So
like, hey, check these boxes.
So it's a lot like real security for a website. It's not a one and done situation, it's an ongoing situation. And so we have Karen has unmuted. Karen, would you like to ask any follow-up on this?
No, thanks. Thank you for that.
Okay. And our next question comes from Omar. Following up on the checklist question, where do I start? I feel like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? That's a great question. How do we even know what direction to start going in?
So the first thing to do is to really make an assessment of your scope and like what it is that you do in that particular business. Now, you may be an agency that has a lot of clients that you're handling this for, and you've got to take and scope each one, because even within their businesses, I'll give you an example. We deal with clients that have stores that are both only on the internet, but then also it crosses over into the fact they have brick and mortar stores that take physical cards. As soon as you
Mhm.
introduce a variable like that, it changes their scope. And it's not just you're only in charge of this and someone else is in charge of that. It's at that point who has ownership over the compliance management, and you're dealing with the entire scope, because it's not just this only applies to just the e-commerce portion. It then all all portions of it apply to all of the scope. So it just makes sometimes your life more difficult in terms of what the requirements are.
So where do you really start? Like
So
the
I
scoping?
always tell people
Where
when they're
like
looking at it is
where's
starting by a,
where's point A?
yeah, start by looking at your, like in this case, let's take one site, for example. You want to look at that and make an inventory of exactly what the site is, what are you, what commerce you're performing, what tools you're using, and making that inventory. Because like if somebody were to come to us and say, hey, we want you to perform compliance management for us, the first thing as part of onboarding we're going to be sending you is what are you using, what plugins you have, what themes you've got, like what does the stack look like from the hosting portion up to the actual like site itself. Once you have that, you can then go after saying, what is my scope of PCI that I need to apply to this site?
All right. The next one is from Eric, and we're talking about content security policies and if a dedicated one for the checkout page is good practice. Eric, would you like to unmute and tell us a little bit more about your question?
Yeah. So as I've read it, I follow Scott Helm over at securityheaders.com, and one of the things I've looked at is he talks about doing content security policies, which obviously are a nightmare of themselves. But I'm just wondering about, does this satisfy the requirements of PCI? Or well, let's not say satisfy. Let's say help and enhance our goals.
Yeah, so typically that falls within like whenever we're talking about script management and preventing things like script injection. So having solid constant security policies and tools that are used in place to manage that, dealing with third-party scripts can help that in the event of like not having skimming attacks, not having, problems that can result from that. So yeah, I mean, certainly that is a piece of that whole puzzle. And that's where everyone's kind of having a risk assessment done, and it's looking at what is your risk of that and implementing those fixes accordingly.
That answer the question for you, Eric?
Yeah.
Great. The next question is from Jean, and she's asking about whether or not this applies to a municipal website, i.e. town website, when they are collecting fees and paying things like your local taxes online. And Jean, I'll go ahead and
Yes.
ask if you want to unmute because you're accepting payment. So you fall under this.
Yeah, and it may go a step further because like we deal with a few municipalities and utilities, and most of the time by requirement, because they are connected to government anyway, they also carry NIST requirements. So you just kind of
And
end up
what is
inheriting
NIST?
all of that. So NIST is going to be a like a whole nother framework of security standards. And so it not only applies to their entire infrastructure for everything from their internal IT all the way to web and web hosting. So
Okay,
it's going to be like your National Institute of Standards.
excellent.
So
Thank you.
currently, the website just has a link for the taxes. There's just a link, pay your taxes online, and a link goes to some vendor that they had, that the towns have partnered with to collect the taxes, and then the vendor collects a fee for it. But they were also looking to, as part of the form, when they fill out forms, like say for a dog license, right now you can fill out the form and send a check separately, and they want to collect the fee for the dog license right on the form. So is that going to be opening up a whole bunch of can of worms, or should it just keep it where it is, where they fill out the PDF form and mail their check?
Even with if the link is just a PDF form and it's not linking to somewhere else that's taking cards, here's where I always tell people when they're sending things off to a separate PDF or a separate resource, and you want to look at it from again, now we always want to see things from the lens of like what the risk is. The risk is if your site is compromised and they redirect that link to something else, and say the PDF has an address on it where they're supposed to send the check and they change that address, the risk is problems with content on the site. So while it's a much more minimized risk when it comes to just having a link, if you do go to the step of like where they're going to have the form and pay those fees and have along those lines, yes, you're increasing your scope, but you're just changing one scope out for another.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Remember, if you'd like to speak your questions, you can just put a question mark into the chat, or you can also type out a short question. While we wait on any other questions, I did want to ask the question that everyone always wants to know and never wants to ask is, what kind of budget are we looking at if we were to hire someone to help us manage this? Let's say we have a small WooCommerce store doing, say, 10,000 a month in revenue, and we're accepting Stripe at checkout.
Yeah, if it does depend on the scope we fall into. So anytime someone were to have an assessment done, or they're looking for someone to handle compliance management in that aspect, the first thing you're doing is, again, finding what is that scope that you're working within. If we're giving the example of what you're talking about, where it's basically fully outsourcing payments to something like Stripe Checkout, PayPal, whatever. You're not storing, processing, or transmitting the cardholder data. It's being handled by that third party completely. And let's say it's only falling within A or AEP. Usually your starting point of where that is going to be is going to like start around $500, go from there. Because you're getting that initial assessment and remediation, and then you're taking that and then going into the steps of like compliance management, which is something that carries like a monthly fee. But once you set that up and you build that relationship with like an MSP or MSSP to perform that stuff, you end up with just smaller changes that are just kind of happening along the way, and you're kind of staying within compliance at that point.
So what sort of a monthly kind of ongoing thing would that be? Again, ballpark is perfectly fine.
Yeah, so I think the most common that we see when it comes to, I guess, people that are in this space, and also this is where most of the time people end up falling over into our hosting, because they're like, hey, I don't have to worry about the scope of things. Then it's usually a couple $100s a month.
Are there any? I'm surprised there aren't any more questions. Feel free to ask about, a specific situation, such as I just had listed off a WooCommerce store accepting Stripe. And we'll also list off where you can reach Zac if you'd like to follow up. Great. Jean has another question.
Okay, I'm currently doing Historical Society website, and they want to sell like souvenirs, like there's a mug and a calendar with their little picture on it. And the guy who's doing their money, I don't know what you would call him, he wants to have the thing where people would just deposit into their checking account, not use Stripe, not use a credit card. They don't want to be involved with credit cards. They just want that peer-to-peer deposit in your checking account. I don't know anything about this, so I have not said a thing. Does anybody have experience with this? I don't.
Are you referring to just like strictly ACH payments?
I'm sorry, what is an ACH payment?
Like just like a bank transfer. Are you strictly talking
Yes.
about that? Because most time, if you're selling anything online, you're gonna do it with a card. I don't know too many sites, unless it's something like a much larger ticket item where they're dealing with wires or ACH strictly.
Yeah, no, these probably would just be local people, and it's kind of like an extension of, they want to order 2 mugs and they'll send a check for $10. But if they want to take online payments, like I think one of the things they have is they have an annual picnic, and they want to take online payment for picnic, but they don't want to use credit card. They don't want to sign up for PayPal. They just want people to deposit into their checking account.
So it might be something like listing on the website, send your ACH payment to this bank info.
Yes.
Okay.
Again, your risk on that is if your site gets compromised and they change what that bank info is, that's where you're kind of looking at that scope. If you're using any form of a payment gateway, you're going to want to make sure you find, okay, what requirements they have to stay within that compliance.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question is from Eagle.
Yes. Hi, Zac. Thanks for being here today. You said they want to, they move to your hosting and therefore they don't have to deal with the compliance. What does that mean?
It's not that they don't have to deal with the compliance. It's just whenever part of doing anything with these risk assessments is you're assessing also your own hosting as well. And so when you're dealing with that, it's you're either having somebody go in and implement remediation changes and hardening on those systems, or you're in charge of just making sure those things are maintained. So usually, if like let's say some of our clients that we handle compliance management for, they want to reduce the surface to where they have to handle any of that stuff, and a lot of our stuff gets automated when we spin up new sites. All that stuff kind of gets handled. It doesn't mean that you're still not responsible for making sure that your hosting is compliant in doing that. It just means that you have an engagement with someone like us that is saying, hey, we're guaranteeing that we have compliant hosting. Here's all the things we do to maintain and handle that. And that means that whenever it comes to doing your SAQ and you're filling it out, you can say, yes, we've got those things.
Okay, you're answering the question like you're selling to a client. I'm asking the question from the standpoint of if I'm hosting, how is it that, because that's separate from doing a website. As a host, you're saying that you are PCI compliant as a host.
So whenever it comes to it, both things are kind of part of the package itself. So whenever you let's say you're just doing the site, but the client hosts their own site itself, and you're simply the person providing it. If you're in charge of handling the compliance management for that client, that scope always bleeds over into the hosting.
What I'm saying is I'm hosting. How do I separate my compliance for the hosting from their compliance as a, because you're saying they move to your hosting and that deals with the compliance in a certain sense. So that's not what I'm not hearing. How as a host, because I know we have other people on here who are interested in, as a host, how is PCI compliance apply to me?
As you as the host, as soon as you, and this applies for any type of compliance, you as the host, as soon as you take on a client that has a certain scope, know that that scope is going to apply to you in full. So like, for example, I carry clients that have HIPAA, NIST, PCI to the max. I have to carry all of that same level of compliance on my own systems as their provider. And so that's when you start taking in a client for yourself that is handling that, just know you're putting that bear of handling that for yourself too.
Okay, so it's not just a specific level for your servers. You're just saying, okay, I will take on the PCI, dealing with the PCI for you.
Yeah, it's you.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like you as an organization are then responsible for that for yourself too. So a lot of people push that off of themselves by saying, well, I'm going to host that with somebody as a known, compliant host. I have clients that do it both
That's
ways.
the part that throws me, because you say a known compliant host, but then you say the compliance is based on what the client is.
Can I
If
rephrase slightly? Let's
Please.
say someone is hosting with a very well-known name like GoDaddy, and they're accepting credit cards on their WooCommerce site. How much is on GoDaddy? How much is on the business?
everything is always on the business itself when it comes to handling compliance, and that's where what solution providers or what they use to get them to compliance is always completely up to them. You as the subject matter expert that's helping this business when it comes to building their site and doing that, oftentimes are the ones that they're asking, hey, I need your help to get making sure I have a PCI compliant solution. Well, you as that agency, oftentimes, and we work with several agencies that they make beautiful sites, they make great stuff that's functional, it works well, but security and compliance is not their forte. They're at that point usually outsourcing it to someone like us to help apply and handle those things. So the business at the end of the day is the one responsible for making sure that they are compliant, because they're the ones taking those cards and they're the ones that really are filling those SAQs and are attesting to saying we are compliant. But you as the agency that may be helping them do that, as soon as you take on that client, and I hope that you have a good contract with them, are also taking on responsibility to make sure that you yourself are compliant, because by touching the back end of that site and do that adds risk into the mix. So you yourself need to be compliant. Does that make sense?
So as a host, yeah, I'm selling hosting. What do I have to do to be PCI compliant separate from what they have to do? That's the question I'm kind of getting at, because we've got people on here who sell hosting. We've got, and we actually interface from like GridPane. So, there's levels of hosting there. So it's like, where does our hosting become compliant separate from the?
That's where we have clients that literally host all of their client sites and handle all of that interfacing with their end users, which are those end clients. What I always tell folks is you want to, look at, let's say you're hosting 10 sites or however many sites. What is the high water mark of where those sites fall? People always, see that tipping point when they take that first medical client that has to have HIPAA compliance. Well, what happens then is your entire infrastructure that is touching that needs to also be HIPAA compliant. So in the case of this, it's like if you have a PCI compliance that is, PCI AEP, the first one you add into that mix, just know your organization also needs to carry that.
So is that per server or per the whole infrastructure?
Yes, depend. Also, that gets into like how you're separating infrastructure. So if you are completely air gapped and separated, you change your scope a bit. But again, then we start looking at how are you accessing these servers to where, again, you're looking at this from a risk management standpoint. You are that risk piece in the mix. So we want to see, how you're accessing. It goes from a more policy driven standpoint. So rule of thumb though is if you have one, it's your organization should be that level of compliance as well across the
Okay,
board.
thanks. Thank you.
Patrick wants to jump in, so let's go ahead and let Patrick in. Should only be moderately dangerous.
How's everybody doing?
We're
Good,
okay.
good. Good to
We're
see you
okay.
here.
Chatting all about
Good.
PCI.
Yeah. So, so I just wanted to jump in with a little bit more context that hopefully will maybe answer this a bit more for
anyone
Eagle
who-
or for anybody.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know,
Yes.
Patrick is the CEO of GridPane Hosting, and we were just talking about GridPane Hosting with Eagle, which is why he's jumping in to help give us some more context around that hosting situation.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So, so when we, so I'll give you a quick example of a story that I think is useful, and then I'll sort of answer it specifically. So I was messaging with someone, this is months ago, that they had just gotten a new client. That client operated in the quote home services unquote space. And they were getting lots of website builds, and they reached out to me about hosting. And then I asked, okay, what kind of home services? And because I'm picturing like HVAC and gutter guards and tree trimming and stuff, and they say hospice care. And I said, oh, well, this is a whole different thing. This you need to have HIPAA compliant everything across all of this. And they're asking a few more questions, and they ultimately say, so is it more expensive? And I said, yes, absolutely. And they said, well, why? And I said, because of the liability. And they said, the liability for who? And I said, the liability for everyone, for you, for me, for whoever the infrastructure provider is, for everyone. And they had no concept whatsoever that they were literally building websites and collecting, protected patient health information, and they weren't doing anything HIPAA compliant. None of what they were doing was HIPAA compliant. And so at GridPane, we don't talk about HIPAA compliance or PCI compliance a lot because most of the people that are asking for it have no idea what it is. And sort of to a lot of Zach's points, they think that it's some like box that you can check. It's like a destination, and they don't realize that it's a vector. It's like a constant moving process. It's a constant living, breathing, ongoing thing. And so we do provide some of our clients with HIPAA compliant hosting, and we do provide some of our clients with PCI compliant hosting, but we don't talk about these things in mass because I'm not even going to consider it with a guy like that. Like, he had no idea even remotely what needed to be happening on his end and on his client's end, and he wouldn't know if I was doing my job right. So I'm not going to work with a guy like that, no matter how much money he's willing to pay me. And I can assure you he was not willing to pay me what it would have actually cost. And so, sort of, I guess, which is a long roundabout way to say, to your point, Eagle, it really comes down to, if you are going to offer PCI compliance for someone, you absolutely can do that in the context of GridPane, and you yourself can do it in the context of GridPane without even asking anybody's permission. But we won't extend to you a checkbox or a signed contract or an SLA that guarantees PCI compliance unless, number one, there's appropriate fees attached, and number two, we know a lot about what's happening behind the scenes in terms of your setup, so that we can confidently, sign off on the liability that we're taking on to say, yes, this is PCI compliant, and yes, we'll help you pass the test and we'll help you do these things. But it's not going to be part of our core regular services, even though from a technical and quote unquote security standpoint, it's all fairly formulaic with all of these things around compliance. It's basically, how much are you willing to put your ass on the line, and how much actual liability and exposure are you willing to stomach? And again, it's all just about having the right processes and the right internal checklists and all these other things. But ultimately, it starts to become, at the end of the day, it starts to become about insurance. And then your insurance provider goes, well, is Zach doing all of these right things? Is GridPane doing all these right things? And so that's, I think, hopefully that answers a little bit better kind of your question, Eagle, as far as like how do you do it? At the end of the day, there are technical boxes that you have to check, but it really just becomes about how much liability are you willing to stomach, and do you have the appropriate insurances and cash reserves and all of these things to weather that storm. So does that help?
It just raised a little bit more confusion. It sounds like you're saying I can't be PCI compliant hosting unless I interface with you and work with you to be.
No.
Oh,
You
okay.
absolutely can do it. You can do it yourself, but GridPane is not going to say, yeah, we rubber stamped that and we agreed to PC,
Oh,
we're
okay.
providing
Yeah.
them,
I got that.
So it's ultimately like you can do HIPAA compliant hosting, you can do GDPR compliant hosting, you could ultimately get, FedRAMP or something like that if you actually wanted to, but that's really all down to you deciding how much of that liability you want to take on and how much of it you want to stomach. Because at the end of the day, like there's companies that'll just say like, yeah, we're SOC 2 compliant. And then you like lean into it a little bit and you go, what does that mean? And it's like, well, we run all of our stuff in a SOC 2 compliant data center. And it's like, that's
Right.
not at all the same thing. That is not at all the same thing at all. Like
Okay.
right now, you can go and look at the compliance pages of Vulture, for example, and Google actually has this. They have one of the most beautiful websites I've ever seen for this particular topic, where it's like they talk about in every single data center, what is our compliance with this specific thing. And it's like, yeah, you can say it is HIPAA compliant because it's in a HIPAA compliant data center, but that doesn't mean that any of your practices and processes and internal systems and how you store data and how you handle password reset policies and all these things, like that's all on you. And so a lot of people work with AWS, for example, because AWS will just email you a rubber stamped BAA agreement for HIPAA compliance, for example. I know we're talking about PCI compliance here, but HIPAA compliance, I think, is a little bit easier for people to realize, like, oh shit, I should not be, I should be very, very careful in this context. Not that you should be any less careful in the context of PCI, but Amazon will just let you download their agreement that says, yeah, we're HIPAA compliant, and now they don't care what you're doing because they know what their systems are and they know what their liability is. And they know that they have billions of dollars behind the scenes that it's like, yeah, sue me. That's fine. I'll be able to show that I demonstrably checked every single box that I could. That doesn't have anything to do with if Zac's using it wrong. If Zac's using it wrong, then that's not on Amazon, that's on Zac. And Amazon knows, hey, we lived up to our obligations because we have checked all of the boxes that make us comfortable saying, yeah, just go ahead and download this BAA agreement, even though I have no idea what you're doing on my servers,
Got it. Thank you.
All right. We are going to move on to the flow chart. So Zac sent over the flow chart. And so I just want to briefly go down the left side. And I want Zac to kind of explain what a couple of these things are. So the first question is service provider. Are you a service provider? What exactly does that mean?
So most of the time, whenever you're referring to being a service provider, it's like if you're a merchant who like store, process, or transmit cardholder data. So you're getting like the full PCI scope. That's going to
So
be like
that's usually
that's
Stripe.
most of the
So
time
Stripe is a
it's Stripe,
service
or
provider.
if you're we've got some utilities that they're providing services. They store cards. They don't just store payment intents. They are acting, and they end up with the full scope of that. It's why it's simple. It's just like, are you doing that? Yes. And there's even, and this is where you can pull the entire 400-page document of that, which spells out being able to determine that. But in the scope of most people with e-commerce, they're not considered a service provider. Most people fall within, they're going to look at those e-commerce transactions, that very bottom section, and
We'll
kind of
get
flow
there.
through that way.
So the next one is the storage of electronic cardholder data. So this is a really interesting one because we have, does a merchant store any cardholder data, including legacy data? And I happen to know that there are a few different people who have, say, written down credit card information, and they're storing that in electronic documents for use later. Does that mean that they're being hit with that big SAQD?
Yes, but also that's just not a great idea as a rule anyway. Even if if you went the route and said, you know what, we're gonna run the full compliance, you'll quickly find that storing them that way is not a good idea.
Yes. So the next one is, does the merchant accept transactions protected by PCI listed P2PE solution? I haven't the slightest idea what that one is.
That's going to be for if you're using some kind of point-to-point encryption solution, such as, banks often use it. If you've got those those check readers for deposits and stuff like that, that's mostly for different types of organizations.
That's very large organizations.
Yeah, typically.
All right. The next one is going to hit a lot of people who are both brick and mortar and also online. So this is card present transactions. Does the merchant accept card present transactions that are not protected by a PCI listed P2PE solution?
And this is also one thing that clarified for 4.0 is if your customer has people running around with those like you've got the those Stripe readers or those physical readers when they're out in the field, they consider that, physical card present. So this is going to be any of your brick and mortar, like a lot of service-based businesses will run that, even if they also run things from an e-commerce standpoint.
Yeah, so that one definitely we will find that some people who are, yes, they have maybe the Shopify app, maybe the Stripe app, maybe the PayPal app. They're accepting those on their phone where the card is present. Then the next one is, does the merchant accept Modo transactions that are not protected by a PCI listed P2PE solution? Can you explain that one? What a Modo transaction is?
So anything that is going to be considered that, it's kind of like your catch-all for like all other transactions that are going to be like your old school, like mail order, telephone order payments. So if like someone's calling in a credit card, which
Okay.
again, I don't really recommend, but it does happen a lot, especially for service businesses.
Oh, yes, definitely. There's, a lot of businesses that, there's an HVAC company and they're like, yeah, you can just call us with your credit card number and we'll process
And it
it
goes
right
back to
there.
the question we had earlier where it's like, hey, if I have a form and I, fill out the thing and do a mail order, credit
Mhm.
card authorization or, payment authorization, that's kind of that catch-all for those.
Yeah, so that's why we have a lot of overlap here on the chart between the card present transactions and the Modo transactions, because you're basically going to end up in the same boat for which one you end up with. And then we finally have the e-commerce transactions. And so these are going to be pretty much everyone's going to fall into this category if they didn't fall into card present or Modo. And that's if they accept e-commerce transactions. And so here we have a little bit of information about whether someone is going to end up at the SAQA or the SAQEP. So do you want to quickly just talk about the difference between the A and the EP and who's in which?
Yeah. So the most common reasons like somebody would fall on A versus like AEP is if you're using like a contact form with Stripe or some other kind of integration and you're using like, let's say it's using Stripe Elements or Checkout, most of the time that's going to fall within A.
The
It's when
iframe, yeah.
you're fully outsourcing payment processing to a quote unquote compliant third party and you're not storing the credit card processing data. They even took it so far as not storing the payment intents. That would immediately push you into EP. EP, on the other hand, is like, if, let's say you have a direct integration with a payment processor, you're doing it with an API, which again, you want to look exactly how it's being implemented on whatever plugin you're using. So if they're using like Stripe API to do it, you fall immediately into EP. Or if it's, say you're using some kind of JavaScript or like, Braintree drop-in, whatever, those are usually using the JavaScript, something like that to implement that. So then you fall under AEP.
Awesome. So I think that mostly wraps us up. If we have any other questions, just drop a question mark into the chat. Eagle asked a question about getting a link to the flowchart, and yes, I'm going to pop that onto a public URL and give you guys that link in just a moment. Otherwise, I will just watch the chat for a moment to see if anyone else comes in with a question. Otherwise, again, you can reach Zac at liveuptothehype.com. Eagle has another question.
So I have one client who offers surf lessons, but they do all of their booking through another company. So if you go to their website and you click on a link to say, hey, book a a lesson, it switches them over to a totally different website, which handles all the booking. What's their level of PCI compliance, or if they have any at all?
So again, you want to see like how they're, how they're implementing it on that side. If it's literally just a link and it's, completely to a third party, like say you're a, I've seen travel agents that push everybody over to corporate for booking, then, at that point, their scope is, next to nothing. But again, you want to look at it just from a risk standpoint. At that point, and I have to see the site and the link itself, and feel free if you wanted to drop me an email or hit our site contact form. If it's literally just going to that third party and say, hey, go book there, then that other site is the one that's carrying that, that scope. But as soon as that's where, as long as they're not embedding the form, collecting it anyway on that site, that would be where it would fall back on
So
I guess
would
the
they
original site.
basically complete an SAQA, but it would be a super quick completion, as you'd say no to most of it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you'd end up with, whenever you start talking through the sections of like, you're taking inventory of what scripts are here, you're stating, hey, we're using this third party to handle that. We're linking off to them. You're acknowledging what level of risk you do have in that whole chain. And it's like a 24 question thing. It's super quick and easy. There's not a lot of scope to be done in that case.
So probably even someone doing it for the first time with this kind of a situation, you could complete it in under 30 minutes and basically be done.
Yeah.
You said drop you an email, but I don't have your email address.
On
Even if you
the
wanted to hit the contact form on our
website.
website,
Yep.
yeah, you can
Move
just
up to the
hit it there.
hype.com.
Okay, so we'll do. This is the site that they transfer everybody to. So all the payments are handled by this company altogether. There's no physical financial transactions on their site, period.
That's where more than likely their scope, and I don't want to tell people like you're going to have no scope. I'd want to see the exact process that, for that particular client. But if they're pushing it off and there's literally nothing that touches it, there are rare situations where it's like, hey, I don't even need to do SAQA. But in most cases, it's like doing the SAQA is 24 questions, and even most of those are going to say not applicable, and you fill it and you're done. So it's such a quick and easy thing that in most cases it's just like filling out the SAQA to say, yep, we're good. We've done what we're supposed to do. This is who's responsible for this portion of it. Satisfies what you need.
So pretty much everybody should do
an A at the minimum.
99% of people need to, like in today's realm, because again, we're doing risk-based stuff, not anything else. It's like you fill your A, but even some of those things you may answer not applicable because you're literally using a third-party provider with their own hosted stuff. You're not embedding any entry fields onto your site. You're not collecting or storing any payment or payment intents. Like none of that stuff applies to you, but you're stating that you've acknowledged and like gone through the process to like say that we've identified everything running on our site. This is what we're doing, and you're more or less setting yourself up for success in that regard.
Wunderbar.
All right. I think that pretty much wraps us up for today. Thank you again to Zac for joining us. You have been absolutely wonderful, and we hope that you feel better soon. Get over that flu. If you guys have questions outside of our meetup times, feel free to take a look at the website for Baltimore WordPress Meetup. And also there is a wphelpdesk.support site that has a bunch of other support materials and information and resources.
Brought out the big guns today. You got Zac and Patrick on here.
Exactly. I got connections.
He pays us in baked goods.
Yes.
Well, it's an acceptable form.